The Thompsons thought they found their perfect home, a place where they could finally start fresh, raise their children, and settle into a life of peace. The house was newly renovated, a charming little cottage tucked away on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and untouched nature. It was just far enough from the hustle and bustle of city life to offer tranquility, but close enough for convenience. The price was right, the house was in good condition, and for the Thompsons, it seemed like a dream come true. But as soon as they moved in, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything overt at first. No loud bangs or visible figures. It was small, subtle things that set their nerves on edge. Doors that wouldn't stay closed, or windows that seemed to open on their own. There were whispers, quiet, unintelligible voices, that floated through the house late at night, so faint that you could easily convince yourself you imagined them. But the longer they stayed, the more Jennifer and Mark began to notice something was wrong. It wasn't just the house settling. Something was lurking in the shadows, something they couldn't explain. At first, they tried to brush it off, but every time they thought they were just being paranoid, something else would happen, something they couldn't ignore. One night, as Jennifer was unpacking boxes in the living room, she turned to glance at the corner of the room, and there it was. A shadow, darker than the room itself, moving against the grain of the light. For a brief second, it flickered, and when she blinked, it was gone. At first, she convinced herself it was just her eyes playing tricks. After all, it had been a long day. But as the days passed, the shadows didn't stay still, they began to move. The house had an old, worn-down charm to it. The floors creaked with every step, the kind of creak that made you feel like someone was walking just behind you, even when you were alone. The walls were paper-thin, and at night, Jennifer swore she could hear faint whispers, as though someone was standing just outside her bedroom door, breathing softly. The windows, though newly installed, never seemed to shut properly. No matter how hard she tried, there was always a slight gap between the frame and the glass, allowing the cold night air to seep through and leave a shiver down her spine. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe with its own life, like it was watching them. Mark had started noticing it too, but he brushed it off as nothing more than nerves. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was alive. And it wasn't a comforting kind of alive. It was as if the house had a mind of its own, a mind that didn't quite want them there. At night, the house groaned as though it was shifting, changing its form with the passing of time. Jennifer would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the house's strange energy. Then, just as she'd almost drifted to sleep, a cold draft would sweep over her, creeping beneath the covers, as though a chilling hand had brushed against her skin. She'd sit up, heart pounding, and find the room still, except for the rhythmic, uneven creaking of the floorboards. "It's just the house," Mark would say, but there was no mistaking the eerie, slow-moving pressure in the air. There was something more, something that shouldn't have been there. The house wasn't just old. It was hiding something, something dark. It started small at first, flickers of movement in the corner of their eyes, shadows that didn't make sense. But soon, Jennifer and Mark couldn't deny it any longer. The shadows weren't just there, they were alive. At night, they would crawl along the walls, stretching and bending in unnatural ways, as though they were trying to escape the confines of the room. Jennifer would wake up in the middle of the night to find the shapes of figures standing just beyond the edge of her vision. When she turned to look, they were gone, but the cold air they left behind lingered, like the chill of a distant presence. "It's just the wind," Mark would say, but Jennifer knew better now. She could feel it too, the oppressive weight of something in the room with them, always watching. One night, she decided to stay awake, determined to catch whatever it was that was causing the disturbance. As the night wore on, she felt the temperature drop, the air around her growing thicker, harder to breathe. Then she saw it clear as day. A shadow slipped from one wall to the next, moving like liquid, bending and reshaping itself in ways that no human figure could. Terrified, she nudged Mark awake, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Did you see that?" But when he looked, it was gone, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread in the air. It was becoming impossible to ignore. They weren't alone in this house, and whatever was here was not going to let them go. In the days that followed, the shadows grew bolder. They started to move in broad daylight, slipping into the corners of rooms, peering from behind furniture, as if they were aware of the Thompsons' every move. But it wasn't just the shadows anymore. The house itself had begun to act strange. The floorboards, which had once creaked softly underfoot, now groaned and shifted on their own. Doors, once firmly shut, would open by themselves, and cold gusts of air would sweep through rooms, carrying with them the unmistakable scent of decay, like something long dead, forgotten. It was a dark and stormy night when the Thompsons finally reached their breaking point. The house had been tormenting them for weeks, and it had become clear that no matter how many times they tried to ignore it, the darkness in the walls would not let them go. The whispering, the shadows, the coldness, it was all too much. They had to know the truth, and they had to know it now. One night, Mark had an idea. "Maybe there's something behind the walls," he said, a grim determination in his voice. "Maybe it's something, or someone, that's been here all along." Jennifer was hesitant, but she knew he was right. They couldn't keep living like this. So they set to work, tearing down a section of the wall in the old living room, just as a crack of thunder echoed across the sky. As the plaster crumbled to the floor, a chill filled the room. They paused, the hair on their necks standing on end. And there, hidden deep within the walls, they found it. A small, cramped space, barely large enough to fit a person, lined with strange symbols, old relics, and a horrifying sight that would haunt them forever. In the center of the hidden room, there was a shrine, the kind used for dark rituals long forgotten. The air was thick with the stench of something rotting, something that had been sealed away for far too long. And as they stepped closer, they could feel it, the unmistakable presence of someone who had been waiting in the dark, their eyes watching, always watching. There, among the dust and broken stone, lay remnants of a long-dead figure, someone who had been bound to the house for reasons they couldn't yet understand. But as Jennifer reached out to touch the shrine, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift violently, swirling around them in erratic patterns. And that was when it happened. A whisper, soft at first, like a breeze, escaped from the walls. It was low, guttural, a voice they could barely understand. And then it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. The voice called her name. "Jennifer, Jennifer." The voice was sharp, haunting, and unmistakably human. But it wasn't just any voice. It was the voice of someone long gone, someone who had once lived and breathed in this very house. But now, that voice belonged to something else, something that had never left. It was as if the house itself was alive, aware of their every move, and it wanted them gone. Terrified and unable to comprehend what they had just uncovered, the Thompsons knew they could no longer stay. They packed up their things, leaving behind everything they had worked so hard for. The house was left in the dead of night, with only the faintest whispers of the shadows lingering behind them, as if watching them leave. But though they thought they had escaped, the shadows followed them. Months later, the house was sold once again, this time to a new family. The Thompsons had hoped that the horrors of that house were behind them, that they had left it all behind. But just as they feared, the malevolent presence had not been confined to the walls they had so desperately tried to escape. It had been waiting for new victims, for someone unaware of the darkness hiding within. The new neighbors, unaware of the house's past, moved in without hesitation. The place seemed perfect for them, just like it had for the Thompsons. But it didn't take long before the same eerie events began to unfold. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots. At first, they thought it was just an old house settling, like the Thompsons had before them. But soon the shadows started to move, just as they had before, creeping from corner to corner, bending and twisting in unnatural shapes. And then, the whispers began again, low, guttural, calling out to them. The same voice from before. "Jennifer, Jennifer." The new tenants couldn't understand why the house felt so alive, or why they couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching. But it didn't matter. The house had claimed its next victims, just as it always had, and just as it always would. The cycle had begun again. Sarah had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. The constant rush, the never-ending hum of traffic, the overcrowded streets. She was tired of it all. So when she found a picturesque house tucked away in the woods, it seemed like the perfect escape. It was isolated, peaceful, and serene, just what she needed. Nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by towering trees and overgrown paths, the house stood as a quiet retreat from the world. The kind of place where one could finally catch their breath, regain some peace of mind. It was affordable too, much more so than the cramped apartments in the city. She jumped at the chance. But little did she know, this house had secrets, secrets that were buried deep within its walls. And whatever had been left behind was still there, waiting. When Sarah first arrived, the house looked like something out of a fairy tale. It was charming, the kind of place you'd find in a storybook. But as the sun began to set and the long shadows crept across the property, the peaceful serenity she'd expected began to feel off. There was something about the house that didn't feel quite right. As she unpacked and began to settle in, she realized that despite the house's outward beauty, it felt eerily empty. Empty not of people but of life. It felt as if something, or someone, had never truly left. A sense of unease clung to the air, as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to make her move. But Sarah didn't know this yet. She thought she had found her dream home. But in reality, it was a nightmare in disguise, waiting to slowly creep into her life, piece by piece. At first, the oddities were easy to brush off. The kind of things you convince yourself are nothing. A draft through the cracks in the windows. The feeling of being watched when no one was there. But the longer Sarah stayed, the more unsettling the incidents became. The house, which once seemed so charming, now felt like a trap. The fireplace, which should have been cold in the summer months, was filled with remnants of ash, as though it had been used recently. But Sarah hadn't touched it. In fact, she hadn't even lit a fire since moving in. Strange sounds became a part of her nightly routine. Footsteps echoing down the hall when she was certain no one else was in the house. At first, she thought it was the house settling, as old houses do. But there was something different about these sounds. The footsteps were deliberate, as if someone was pacing, waiting. She tried to shake off the unease that crept into her thoughts. But when she went to bed at night, the sounds seemed louder, closer, like someone was just beyond the door, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Then there were the locks. No matter how many times she checked, no matter how hard she tried, some of the locks on the doors refused to work properly. At first, they wouldn't turn. Then, they seemed to lock and unlock on their own. She was no stranger to old homes, but this was something different. There was a hidden, almost malicious intent behind these strange occurrences, and Sarah couldn't put her finger on it. It wasn't just the physical things either. Sarah began to notice something else, an overwhelming sense of isolation. The woods around her house were quiet, yes, but too quiet. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, no passing cars. It felt like she was alone in the world, trapped in a place where time had forgotten to move. And though she was alone, it felt as if the house was always with her, watching her, silently judging her every move. As the days passed, Sarah's unease grew stronger. She began to feel like she was losing her grip on reality. The house wasn't just old, it was ancient, filled with secrets it didn't want her to uncover. One rainy afternoon, as she sorted through some boxes in the attic, she found something that would change everything. Tucked away beneath old sheets and dusty furniture was a leather-bound journal. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but it still held a faint trace of something more. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted to know what was inside. But curiosity pulled her in, and soon she was reading the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The journal belonged to the previous owner, a man named Alan, who had lived in the house before her. As Sarah flipped through the pages, she discovered something that made her skin crawl. Alan had written about hearing whispers at night, soft, insistent whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. He spoke of a presence that he could never fully explain, something that moved in the shadows, something that wouldn't let him leave. The further Sarah read, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a case of a man with a vivid imagination. This was a man who had been tormented by the house, driven to madness by its dark influence. But it was one passage that stopped her cold. The house will never let you leave. The whispers will follow you, and the shadows will grow. They will find you, even if you try to run. Alan's last entry was chilling. I can feel it behind me now, watching. I don't know how much longer I have. The last pages were empty, as though Alan had vanished, leaving behind only his words. No one ever knew what happened to him after that. Sarah's heart began to race. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in around her. The whispers from the journal weren't just stories, they were real. And they were calling to her now. The night Sarah's nightmare became real, she had no idea how much darker it would get. She had been lying awake, tossing and turning in bed, the weight of the journal's revelations pressing heavily on her mind. The silence of the house was suffocating. The wind outside howled, but inside, everything was still. Too still. That's when she noticed it. A sudden, bone-chilling cold that filled the room, seeping into her bones. It wasn't like the usual drafts she'd grown accustomed to. This was different. It was like the very air had turned icy, a suffocating chill that made it hard to breathe. She sat up, heart pounding in her chest. The room, once comforting, now felt hostile, alien. And then she saw him. Standing at the foot of her bed, his figure almost blending with the shadows, was a man, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. Alan. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could barely speak, her body frozen in place as she stared into the empty eyes of the man who had lived here before her. But something was wrong. His eyes were not merely empty. They were hollow, black, devoid of life. And yet, there was a presence there, a presence that screamed of pain, of something unspeakable. "You shouldn't have come here," Alan whispered, his voice like gravel, raspy and filled with an ancient bitterness. His figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though he were a shadow trying to escape the light. And as Sarah's eyes locked onto his, she saw it, the thing that had been with Alan all along. From the corners of the room, movement. Shadows, shifting like smoke, swirling and pulsating in unnatural ways, growing thicker, darker, as if they were alive too. "You can't leave," Alan said again, his voice now echoing through the room, filling the air with a dark certainty. He stepped closer, his form becoming more solid, more real. The shadows that followed him moved like tendrils, curling around his body, extending towards Sarah, reaching for her with outstretched fingers. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, choking her. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. There was no escape. Suddenly, the house groaned. The walls seemed to bend inward, as if the very structure of the building was alive and closing in on her. And in the midst of it all, Alan's cold, dead eyes never left her. He wasn't alone. The whispers, those whispers from the journal, had become voices all around her, a cacophony of unintelligible words. The walls themselves seemed to be speaking to her, as if they were calling out, reaching for her. Then, in the blink of an eye, Alan was gone. But the shadows remained. They lingered, swarming around Sarah like hungry beasts, and she knew now, that there was no way out. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed Alan before her. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. The next morning, Sarah couldn't leave fast enough. She packed what little she had left, her few belongings, her sanity hanging by a thread, and fled the house. The air felt lighter as she stepped out the door, but the weight of what she'd seen, what she'd felt, would never leave her. The house still stood, empty, silent, waiting for its next victim. Months passed. The house was sold once again, this time to a young couple eager to start their life together in the quiet countryside. They never suspected a thing. The walls were fresh, the rooms inviting, and the memories of the Thompsons and Sarah's departure seemed to fade. But something was wrong. They didn't know it yet, but the house had already begun to whisper to them. It started small, strange noises in the night, objects moved out of place. They brushed it off at first, as most people do. But it didn't take long for the whispers to grow louder, for the shadows to start shifting. And when they found the journal buried deep in the attic, they too began to feel the suffocating pressure of the house's curse. The journal, once belonging to Alan, now sat there, waiting for the new inhabitants to read its warnings. And just like Sarah before them, they started to hear the voice, low and insistent, whispering their names. "You shouldn't have come here," the journal seemed to say. And, just as before, the house began to claim them. Alan had never truly left. The house was alive, and it would never let go of its hold. The cycle had started again, as it always would. And the whispers would continue forever, filling the rooms with memories of those who dared to live in the house, those who never left. The Millers had finally found their dream home. It was large, with plenty of space for their growing family. Nestled on the outskirts of a small town, it was the perfect place to start a new chapter of their lives. The house was charming, wooden beams, large windows letting in the sunlight, a big backyard where their children could run free. It felt like the perfect sanctuary, tucked away from the chaos of the world. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. The warmth that should have filled the house quickly turned cold, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And the longer they stayed, the more they began to feel the eerie sense that something was watching them. But at first, it was easy to dismiss it as nerves. The house was new, after all. But the deeper they settled in, the more undeniable the feeling became. Something in the house wasn't quite right. The Millers began to notice small things, slight shifts in the air, the cold spots that would appear in the rooms, even when the windows were sealed tight. The house, which once seemed so welcoming, now felt like an empty shell, echoing with an unsettling stillness. The family brushed it off as nothing at first. Perhaps it was just an old house settling. But then, the strange occurrences started to build, one by one, until they were impossible to ignore. The house was watching them. It all started subtly at first. The air in the house grew uncomfortably cold, especially at night. No matter how high they turned up the heat, there were certain rooms, the attic, the hallway outside the children's rooms, that felt frozen, as though the air itself had been frozen in time. Then came the whispers. At first, the Millers thought it was just the wind, the house groaning as old homes tend to do. But when they started hearing it at night, soft, unintelligible murmurs coming from the walls, they began to wonder if something else was at play. It wasn't like the creaking of floorboards or the sound of pipes. No, this was different. It was a voice, faint but clear, as if someone was just beyond the walls, watching them in the dark. The first time Sarah Miller heard it, she was alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. She stopped mid-slice, hearing a soft hum behind her, faint, almost melodic. It sounded as if it were coming from the walls themselves, vibrating through the house. When she turned to look, the house was still silent. She stood there for a long moment, trying to shake off the feeling that someone was there with her, someone just out of sight. The humming persisted, night after night, always louder, never stopping. It was as if the house itself had a life of its own, watching, waiting, making its presence known in subtle, unsettling ways. Then came the creaks in the floorboards. It wasn't the house settling anymore. It was something moving through the rooms, something that wasn't supposed to be there. No one could ever trace it back to a single source. But as the days passed, it became clear. The house was no longer just an empty shell. It had awakened, and it was not happy. The Millers were no longer the happy family they once were. The strange occurrences began to wear on them, and the stress began to show. Arguments became frequent. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house with them, someone that didn't belong. She would hear things, a voice calling her name when no one was around, footsteps in the hallway when she was alone, a shadow darting just beyond the corner of her eye. But when she told her husband, Greg, he dismissed it, chalking it up to her imagination. Still, even he couldn't ignore the things happening around them. He began to notice the same things, cold spots, the hum that filled the house, the odd creaks at night. The tension in the house grew thicker by the day. Then one night, the eldest child, Mark, came running into their room, eyes wide with terror. "I saw a man," he whispered, his voice trembling, "standing at the foot of my bed." Greg and Sarah exchanged a glance, but before they could ask more, the boy continued. "He was dark, like a shadow, but when I turned on the light, he wasn't there." The room fell silent, a heavy silence that seemed to press down on them all. Greg quickly brushed it off as a nightmare, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Later that night, when the family tried to leave for dinner, they faced their next terrifying discovery. The car wouldn't start. It was as though something was holding it in place, locking it there. Greg tried everything he could think of, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The house seemed to hum louder then, as if mocking them. Panic set in as the realization sank in. Something in this house wanted them to stay, to be trapped within its walls, just as others had before them. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and the shadows became bolder, moving across the walls like living things, reaching for them, feeding off their fear. Then, one morning, the Millers were gone, vanished without a trace. The house stood in eerie silence, its windows dark, its doors still. The car was parked out front, untouched, as though it had never been moved. Inside the house, everything was left as it had been the night before. Clothes still hanging in the closets, dishes on the table, children's toys scattered across the floor. But there was no sign of Sarah, Greg, or the children. No sign of life. No sound. The house had swallowed them whole. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house the night before. A muffled scream, followed by absolute silence. But by the time authorities arrived, the house was locked tight, the doors and windows secured. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. It was as if the family had simply disappeared into thin air. The house, once their dream home, now stood abandoned, silent, watching. The authorities searched for weeks. They interviewed neighbors, friends, even family members, but no one had seen or heard from the Millers since the day they vanished. It was as though they had been erased from existence. And yet, despite the mystery, the house remained. It stood waiting, watching. And as the days went on, people began to notice strange things. When the wind blew through the trees outside, it almost sounded like whispers, whispers that seemed to come from the house itself. The house hadn't just claimed the Millers. It was waiting for someone else to move in, for the cycle to begin again. The Millers were never found. The authorities could never explain what happened to them. But some say the house still stands, its windows dark, its door creaking open in the night. If you listen closely, you can still hear the faint whispers, the same whispers that haunted the Millers. Some say, when you stand in front of the house, you can almost hear their voices, calling for help, begging to be let out. But the house doesn't let them go. The house doesn't forget. It waits. And every so often, a new family moves in, unaware of what lurks inside. And every so often, they disappear, just like the Millers. And just like the others before them. The house is never empty for long, and it never lets anyone leave. Which of these chilling stories sent a shiver down your spine? We want to know which one haunted you the most. Share your thoughts, and if you've experienced something like this yourself, don't be shy, leave a comment below. Let's see who else has felt the chilling touch of the unknown. And remember, if you want to hear more stories like this, ones that will make your heart race and your skin crawl, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. We have more true horror stories coming your way, ones you'll never forget. Because you never know what's lurking just around the corner, or maybe just behind you.